Здравствуйте, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of History with a Drywaller. In today's episode, we're going to pick up from where we left off last episode, which, as you'll recall, we ended that episode just at the close of the Bolshevik Revolution. In this episode, we are going to cover the life and adventures of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or as he would later become known, and as I'm going to refer to him from here on out, Vladimir Lenin. To get the basics out of the way first, Vladimir Lenin was born in 1870 and he would die in 1924. He was a bright kid who attended a very prominent Russian university, and after witnessing the execution of his older brother, which we covered in our last episode, he ended up becoming, as you can imagine, quite radicalized and quite deeply biased against the Tsar. He would embark on many radical political movements and activity throughout his younger years, and this would lead to him being exiled to Siberia in 1897. This specifically was for distributing banned literature to workers that were on strike. His exile ended in 1900, and in 1902, Lenin would immediately publish a pamphlet called What Is to Be Done, which, by the way, is a reference to an older work by a famous Russian. We're not going to get into it, but it's very evocative and became very famous. And this pamphlet, which would become something of his political manifesto, outlined his belief in a disciplined, centralized, what he called a vanguard party to lead the workers to communist revolution. Now, as you'll recall from our episode on Karl Marx, this is a departure from what would be called classical or orthodox Marxism. Marx believed that the revolution would come as sort of an unstoppable tide, as the inevitability of history made manifest. He did not believe in specific people making specific actions to bring about the revolution. Lenin, however, did, and he believed that as I mentioned, a disciplined communist party was needed to launch this revolution. And of course, being Lenin, he viewed himself as the natural leader of this communist movement. At the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which was held in London in 1903, Lenin would have arguably one of his earliest defining moments. This Congress would see a split between different members of the RSDLP, and in particular, the split would develop between supporters of Lenin and supporters of another man named Julius Martov. Now, Martov wanted freedom of expression and greater individuality in the party, and Lenin, as we mentioned earlier, wanted complete party discipline and absolute unity to the party leadership. At this particular Congress, Lenin's supporters ended up becoming the majority because many of the people who disagreed with him ended up walking out in disgust, and so in a shrewd political maneuver, he took the name of the majoritarians for his party, and majority in Russian is Bolshevik. So that is where their name comes from this Second Congress of the RSDLP. Now, unfortunately, this meant that Martov's supporters, despite arguably being the majority of the RSDLP, became known as Mensheviks, or the minority. But that bit of early squabbling aside, during the First World War, Lenin would end up in Switzerland. He basically couldn't be in Russia, or they would throw him in jail or send him back to Siberia, so he got to have a fun little vacation in Switzerland. That lasted up until the February Revolution, when the Russian Republic was established, that we briefly talked about last time. This would give Lenin an idea, and he would end up negotiating his release with the Germans, promising essentially to take Russia out of the war. Because remember, Germany and Russia are still fighting at this point, and even though the Germans are winning, the Germans would rather be able to win and concentrate all their attention on fighting the Western powers of France and Britain and eventually the United States. The Germans were very pleased at this notion and would put him on a train, famously a sealed train, so he wouldn't cause revolution in Germany, and sent him back to Russia. He would arrive back in Russia in April, and in July, he was back to his old tricks and had organized an armed Bolshevik uprising. This would be known as the July Days, and it failed. After this early failure, Lenin ran off to Finland, again to escape Russian authorities, and he disappears from our story for a bit. Now, during this time of the early Russian Republic, the provisional government was under the control, eventually, of a man named Alexander Kerensky. He was a democratic socialist who, being a democratic socialist, deeply believed and had always believed in the rightness and the goodness and the necessity of democracy in Russia. In my humble drywaller's opinion, I have always really liked Alexander Kerensky. He was liberal, he was humble, he was a brave, if not brilliant, military commander. I think a Russia under Alexander Kerensky would have been a much better place than it turned out to be. Again, in my humble opinion. Just to round out Kerensky, in case we don't get back to him, he would end up, after the Bolsheviks took over, fleeing to New York in the United States, where he lived happily and even married until his death in 1970 at age 89, which means that he outlived Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky. So good for him. Now, after the July days, the Bolsheviks had to go underground for a while, but due to the ongoing war and continued social unrest in the Russian Empire, the Bolsheviks would end up returning to political prominence, and this led immediately to Lenin feeling like it was safe for him to return to Petrograd, which he did. But being Lenin, he immediately called for another armed insurrection to topple the democratic government. And this one succeeded. The Bolshevik militia, known as the MRC, or the Military Revolutionary Committee, would strike and take control of almost all of Petrograd's major infrastructure centers. And not long after, the Bolsheviks would besiege and capture the Winter Palace, officially taking over the Russian government and ending the provisional government and the Russian Republic. Mensheviks, meanwhile, were disgusted by this seizure of power and this destruction of a democratically elected government. Not being unaware of all this growing disgust, the Bolsheviks allowed a constitutional assembly, which had been planned by Kerensky's government, to take place and allowed people to stand for election in November of 1917. Unfortunately for the Bolsheviks, they would lose all but a quarter of the seats up for election. And in the classic style of so many Russian leaders, as we've seen throughout history, Lenin responded to getting trounced in this election by claiming that the election was unfair against, it should be noted, all the evidence of history, and even ordered soldiers to fire upon supporters of the Constitutional Assembly when they demonstrated in Petrograd. And not long after, the Bolsheviks would just disband the Constitutional Assembly by marching soldiers in and closing it down. But the destruction of democratic government wasn't the only thing that Lenin was working on during these years. Lenin would actually embark on a remarkable series of reforms of all aspects of Russian life. These included land distribution, limiting work days to 8 hours, free universal education, converting Russia to the Gregorian calendar, which is the calendar used by the rest of Western Europe. He expanded women's rights, he nationalized industry, he abolished the pre-existing legal system. He was a very busy bee through these years, and not just from the destruction of democracy. Now, among the things that Lenin really wanted for Russia is he wanted Russia to get out of the First World War. And to this end, he would send a delegation headed by none other than Leon Trotsky to the Germans. And because the Germans have basically been winning this whole time, the German demands were pretty harsh. The specifics of the demands aren't really super important because they wouldn't all stick for very long, but Germany essentially wanted to take a ton of Russian territory and almost all of Russian infrastructure. Trotsky felt unable to agree to this surrender demand, essentially, and so embarked on one of the strangest campaigns in diplomatic history. He declared that the Soviet government would not accept the German terms, but that the Soviets considered the war to be over. He said that the Soviet Union would neither have war nor peace. And he left. He went back to Petrograd. Making matters worse, the Bolsheviks began the total demobilization of the Russian army after refusing the German terms. Well, you may be aware, but this is not how negotiations work. The Germans, after getting over their surprise and confusion, and really, it took the German embassy a while to determine what exactly had just happened, they responded by launching a massive offensive across the whole Eastern Front and capturing a staggering amount of territory from the Russian soldiers who had just been told that the war was over and began to demobilize. After this huge mess and humiliating defeat, the USSR signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was actually harsher than the initial German demands. So not exactly an A+ on the foreign diplomacy side. But they had ended the war, which was one of their big goals in the beginning. Now, unfortunately, despite having ended the war, the USSR still faced widespread famine and food shortages. Lenin responded to this in a very classic Lenin way. He blamed these people called kulaks. And what kulaks are essentially peasants or rural farmers who are relatively wealthy. Now, these people aren't nobility, these people aren't the bourgeoisie or the middle class, but they're relatively wealthy for peasants. Lenin didn't like that, and he blamed these kulaks, who he quite famously called bloodsuckers, for, as he put it, withholding and hiding the grain. Now, of course, there's almost no evidence that anyone was hiding grain or that there were these big secret stashes, but Lenin was seemingly convinced that there were. And to this end, he ordered armed detachments of Soviet soldiers to go and requisition grain from the peasants by force. This led to a whole series of peasant uprisings and fighting and guerrilla attacks and mass hangings, and this whole sorry mess would end up growing into what would become the Civil War. But for now, this widespread theft and violence by the government would lead to way lower crop yields because, as you can probably guess, the peasants didn't really want to grow more grain because that would just give them the attention of these armed gangs of Bolsheviks. Of course, Lenin did not think that was what was going on, and so he created a new secret police force known as the Emergency Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. In Russian, the acronym is pronounced Cheka. And yes, this organization would be the precursor to the NKVD and later the KGB. But while they were still called the Cheka, they would launch what's now known as the Red Terror, which was a series of tribunals, kangaroo courts, and mass executions that took possibly over 100,000 lives. It's hard to say exactly how many, as no one kept very good records at this time. The targets of these killings were mostly the wealthy and old czarists, old supporters of Nicholas II, but also among their number were known anti-Bolshevik agitators and many people who the Bolsheviks just decided were unwanted, such as petty criminals and prostitutes. Compounding this terror, in 1919, a wide slew of slave labor camps were established all across Russia, and along with these slave labor camps was a new government agency to oversee and monitor them, known as, in Russian, the Gulag. And this is how these slave labor camps became known as gulags. At this time in Russian history, these labor camps are estimated to have held about 70,000 people. But unfortunately, we have not heard the last of the Gulag. And as if all this violence and chaos wasn't enough, Lenin would call on his Cheka as well as the Soviet soldiers to execute all priests as enemies of the Bolshevik Revolution. In the ensuing chaos, tens of thousands of priests and religious leaders of not only the Eastern Orthodox and wider Christian faiths, but also Jewish and Islamic religious leaders were killed for hardly any other reason than Lenin didn't like them. And of course, as I mentioned previously, all this death and violence and theft would lead directly to the Russian Civil War, which, unfortunately, given the unexpected growth of this episode, is going to have to be covered next time. Unfortunately, in this early era of Russian history, there's just so much going on that I'm going to have to split these into two parts. But before we go today, I would like to cover something that gets brought up a lot when discussing the Soviet Union. And that is the idea, or I should say the question of who is the good guy. Whether you're approaching this from a modern communist or Marxist perspective, or if you're reading Animal Farm by George Orwell, it seems, at least to me, that there's a strong tendency to try to find, for lack of a better term, good guys and bad guys in all this. And if I may, I would like to argue that that isn't a good or healthy way to look at history, but it also, I think, is somewhat fruitless. Now, depending on who you ask, some people say that Lenin would have led Russia to a beautiful new world if only Stalin hadn't ruined it, or Trotsky would have done this or that, but Stalin killed him. Or there's even many people who think that Stalin was actually an amazing, wonderful, and super guy, and that modern capitalists are lying about him, and blah, blah, blah. I don't think any of this is accurate. In my opinion, all of these men, from Trotsky to Lenin to Stalin to Nicholas II, to all these men are nasty, selfish, arrogant, and cold-blooded to a heartbreaking and staggering degree. None of these men, as we've seen, especially with Lenin and Trotsky's presiding over the Cheka secret police and Nicholas II's wild anti-Semitism, and then of course Stalin's being Stalin, none of these men are good men, and none of these men were good leaders. Now, a case can be made, and I have tried to make the case, that Alexander Kerensky was a good man who tried his best, and I think a case can also be made that Khrushchev was a good man who also tried his best. But at this time, in the early revolution, I don't think you have a situation of the good guys fighting the bad guys. I think you have a classic situation of a bunch of ruthless, nasty, powerful villains competing with each other to get more money and more power. And on that heartwarming and inspiring note, we have to end for this week. Next time, we will continue our coverage of the life and crimes of Vladimir Lenin, beginning with the Russian Civil War. I'll see you there.